let's turn this scary black screen called terminal into your superpower. In the next 25 minutes, you'll go from help, what's happening, to what's this? I was a junior software developer when I learned Linux commands properly, and it made me feel super cool and confident. So I want to help you feel that way too with this video. First of all, you learn the best by doing. So if you follow along as I'm showing you the commands, you will learn and remember this knowledge much better. Now the question is, if you want to follow along, how do you even get a Linux environment to practice commands if you have Mac or Windows laptop? Very easy. We're going to use Docker image with Linux operating system in it, with 2 easy steps. First, you're going to download Docker Desktop for your operating system, Windows or Mac, which is super easy. I actually have it for Mac, so I can run it simply by double-clicking on it, and my Docker is up and running. Now, you don't need any knowledge of Docker, so don't worry about that. You only need to install it and execute 2 simple commands, and that's it. Right after that, we move on completely to Linux. So once your Docker is running, open your terminal, whether it's Windows or macOS, built-in terminal, and in the terminal, we're gonna download my custom Docker image that has Linux inside, plus everything else that we need for this demo so you can follow along without any setup, any distractions, super easily. So I will leave the link to my custom image below, and you simply need to copy this command, which basically fetches my image, which is publicly available for you from internet onto your machine. So you have that Linux-based image locally. So I'm gonna execute this. And once we have that image locally, we're gonna execute this command. So basically the name of the image, which is the same as here. And we're gonna run this as a container with this flag, which will give us the Linux terminal inside that Linux container. So execute, and there you go. No other Docker knowledge needed. And with that, we are inside the Linux environment, and the very first command that we're going to use is to check on which operating system environment we are on. So basically validate our Linux environment. And to do that, we have a simple command that's called uname, which basically shows you the name of the operating system that you're using. And there you go, we are on Linux. And this command is short for Unix name. And Unix is basically an underlying operating system that Linux was built on. And by the way, you can download our complete Linux cheat sheet that we created specifically for this video from the video description below. So now that we have our Linux environment set up and ready to use, let's imagine a use case for using Linux commands. Imagine you are a junior engineer debugging your first production issue. An application is not accessible anymore. It has some issues, and you are on an application server now to find out what the problem is with the application. And we're gonna use Linux commands to solve this mysterious issue. So first thing we want to do is we want to check the application logs. We want to see the output of application and whether there are any errors that show exactly what the problem is. So how do we find where the application logs are in the file system? So first of all, let's see where we are currently in the Linux file system. And to do that, we have a command called pwd, which stands for print working directory. And as you see, we are in /root directory, which is root user's home directory, but not where our application lives. So we need to change to the application folder where the application logs are. And in order to change to another directory, we use cd, change directory, and the location of where we want to change. And let's say our application logs are in /var/log/application. And now we see in the path here that we have changed from home directory, changed to this path. So now, if I do pwd, print working directory, there you go. Now, how do we see what files are in this directory? What is the content of this folder? For that, we have ls, which lists all the files and other directories inside this location. So let's execute. And as we see, we have 3 files for the application. Now, let's say I want to see a little bit more information about those files. For example, the size of those files, to see if some of them are empty, or maybe error file is too large, so we have lots of errors inside, as well as permissions. Are those files locked in production so I can't access them? How can we do that? Well, for that, we use a flag or additional parameter for ls-l. So this will give us extended view or additional information for each file, including permissions and the size of the files. So now we say that there is some content inside the error log file. So we want to see what's inside, to see the errors. And to do that, to print the contents of any file, we use a command called cat. And we pass the file that we want to read. And the name cat actually stands for concatenate, which is a fancy word basically for putting strings of text together. And you can use cat command to print out contents of a file. So if I execute, we see that application has logged some errors. Now let's say our error log file is too large and too crowded. So we want to specifically display any information connected to database. So basically we want to filter out all the file contents and only display the lines that have a specific word or phrase in it. And to do that, we use what's called a pipe. And pipe is basically a chain of commands in Linux. So whatever this command outputs will be used as an input for the next command. And the command for filtering out information based on words, phrases is grep. And now we can say, I want to filter all the lines that have database. So only show me those. And let's execute. And there you go. You see this word highlighted as well. And those are all the errors. Now, before going forward, we think it's a good idea to back up and save this information for later reference. So we want to save this into a new file called database errors for future reference. So instead of outputting it here in the terminal, we want to save it in a separate file. How can we do that? We take the output of this command and we forward it to a file, or we write that output into a file using this character. And let's call this file database errors.txt. It's a text file. And let's execute. And now let's validate that our file was actually created by executing ls. And there you go. We have our database errors text file. And now let's also validate that all this content has been saved in this file and it's not empty. First of all, we can do ls-l, and we see that part of this information is here. And we can also do concat. And there you go. Okay, so now I'm thinking, in case this application folder gets cleared out on application restart or new deployment or whatever, for some reason, I actually want to have a backup of this database errors text file in another folder. Actually, in my root user's home directory. So I want to save all the backup files there to make sure I have those. So how can I copy this file and save it as a backup into a new location? Or generally, how do I make a copy of a file? Well, very easy. We have a command cp copy and name of the file that we want to copy and the new file that we want to create. Let's say we don't want such a long name, so let's just call it db errors.txt. But we want this file to be not in the same location, but in /root directory. So how can I do that? Well, I can simply add here the complete path to this new file. So I'm saying, take this file, make a copy, call this copied file db-errors.txt and save it in the root directory. And let's execute. And from here, I can use again ls to list the files in the root directory without changing into root. And there you go. We have our db errors right here. So as you see, I don't have to navigate back and forth. I can execute copy ls cat And other commands, so I can say /db errors. I can use all these commands without navigating to a specific folder. Okay, so now we have a backup. The errors are safely stored away in case I need it later for troubleshooting or referencing. So now I want to do a little bit further analysis. I'm seeing that I have some connection refused errors. And let's say my application has tried to connect to the database 100 times, so I have tons of lines in my error log. So I want to see how many connection errors do I have, or how many times did it try to connect to the database before application crashed. So let's see that. First of all, in the database errors file, I only want to see the lines that has connection refused in it. So I'm gonna grep filter out, and I'm gonna say connection refused. However, when I'm using grep command to search for a phrase instead of just single word, I have to enclose it in quotes. So it knows this is the entire string that I'm looking for. So let's execute, and there you go. And if I have, again, hundreds of such errors, I can count them. I can say, give me a number of these connection refused errors. How many times was the connection retried? And to do that, I'm gonna pipe the output. So the result of this will be piped into the next command called word count. So give me a number of lines where this phrase is used. Let's execute, and there you go. We have our count. Okay, so now we have diagnosed the problem. We know that application is crashing because it cannot connect to the database on port 5433. Now, this port number looks a little bit suspicious because we know that Postgres database port number is 5432. So by default, Postgres will start on port 5432, but the application is trying to connect on this port instead. So there's something suspicious about it. So now we want to see where is this port actually configured for the database. So we want to find the database configuration files in the entire system. How can we do that? We don't know where it's located. We knew the location of application log files, but we don't know where the database configuration is. Someone else configured it, so we have to find it on this entire file system. Well, there is a command called find, and we can look for a specific file name, like database errors, or we can look for a part of the file name. So we know that database configuration will have an extension .conf, but we don't know what the name of the configuration file itself will be. Will it be postgres.conf, db.conf, database.conf? We don't know how it's going to be. So what we're going to do is we're going to say find a file called something.conf. So this is a regular expression, and it basically says find any files that have .conf in the name. However, now we have to tell the system, where do we want to look for this file? Do we want to look for it in the current directory, which will be dot? So let's see. Obviously, there's nothing called .conf in this file. Or we can look in the entire file system by using /. So / represents the root file system, and the file system is a tree-like structure in Linux. So all the files and directories basically stem from this root. So we want to search this file everywhere in the entire file system. Let's execute. Okay, we got quite a few conf files. So now we can use our familiar grep function or command to filter this large list, and let's search for config files that have db in it. Let's see if we find anything. And there you go. We have one file called db.conf, and it seems like it's in /etc/application location. So we found the db.conf file. Now let's actually look for, do we have any other configuration files for db? So let's add another star here, and let's say anything that has conf in it at the end, because maybe there are some additional suffixes for these database configuration files. Let's execute. And okay, there is another backup file in this application folder. That looks suspicious. So now let's actually switch into this folder and check our configuration there. Now, as I said, we don't have to switch to folders to execute ls and cat and so on commands. But if you have to use the file names, then it's just convenient because you don't have to write the entire path. You can just use the file names, right? So it's just a matter of convenience. So now, we can see the contents of the dbconfig file, but I'm actually curious to see what is the difference between db.conf and db.conf.backup file. So someone has changed the configuration and made a backup. So I want to see what's the difference. What have they configured differently? And for that, I'm going to use a command called diff, and I'm going to compare these two. dbconf, and by the way, you can use a key called tab to autocomplete the file names, for example, in the directory. So if I do dot and click on tab, it auto fills, and again, there you go. So this is convenient if you don't want to type out the entire file names in your commands. So let's execute and see what's the difference. Okay, so it seems like the port number to the database has changed for the application. So this is a configuration file that we're passing to our application about how to connect to the database. And we're saying database is on localhost on port 5433. But we know that by default, our Postgres database should be running on port 5432. So the application has the wrong port, and that's why it cannot connect to the running database. Now, of course, our next question is to validate, is the database running? And if yes, is it running on this port or not? So how do we check that? How do we check whether a service is accessible at a specific port? Well, for that, there is a command called curl, which basically is a command line client that can make HTTP requests to services. So you can make a request to a website. Like this. So just like you access applications from browser, you can access applications and services using curl or curl. So let's actually check if the database is running on localhost, which is on the same machine as we are now. So let's do http localhost 5432. We assume that's the port where database is running. And we're going to add an option -i, which basically says, give me only the headers, basically metadata, without downloading the full response of the service. So let's execute. And there you go. PostgreSQL is actually responding on this port. So now we have identified the problem. We know that application is trying to connect to database on a wrong port. So that means we can fix it by specifying the correct port in the database configuration of our application. So as the next step, let's change it. So how do we change contents of a file? Or how do we edit a file in Linux? Well, for that, we have a command line text editor called Vim, V-I-M. And if we pass in the config file, first of all, let's see what happens. As you see, the command line text editor interface shows up, and we can actually make changes here. And Vim editor actually has two modes. It has the edit mode, where we can edit the text, add new lines of configuration, and so on. And the navigation mode, where we can get to the end of the line, and so on. And in order to get to the edit mode, we use I. But let's see what happens when we try to get into the write mode. When I hit I, as you see, we get a warning that says changing a read-only file. So what's happening here? Well, that has to do with file permissions. So let's go back to the terminal, and this can be a tricky part. So how do we exit the Vim editor? Actually very easy when you know how to do it. Hit escape first, and as you see, this here disappears, and then colon Q exclamation mark. And this basically leaves the file without any changes, without trying to save any changes. So basically canceling the edit mode and returning back to the terminal. And as we see with LSL, extended output, we have the file permissions set here, which is another important concept in Linux. And it is actually very simple. The first dash here that you see is representing whether it's a file or directory. And if it's a directory, it will have D standing here. If it's a file, it's just dash. And then we have 3 parts for 3 different users. And each one of those items basically say whether the file has read permission, write permission, and execute permission. So what we're going to do is for our root user, we're going to change the permission of this file. And in production, let's say this config file was locked so that a program or a user doesn't accidentally overwrite the configuration. It's set to read-only mode. So we can only read the file, which we can do by concat, just display the contents. But in this case, we want to modify it. So what can we do? Well, we can add the write permission for the root user to this file to make root user able to write to it. And to change file permissions in Linux, we have a command called chmod to change mode of this file. And we're changing the permissions of dbconf file. And here we can provide what new permissions we want to set. And we can actually set in one command the entire permissions for Linux user, Linux group, or any other users on the system. And it's actually pretty easy. If we want no permissions, it's going to be 000. If we want only read permission for every of the 3 users, it's going to be 444. All the permissions, including write, read, execute, is going to be 777. So let's say we want read and write permission. And let's actually see that. And there you go. Every user has read permissions. Now, everyone has all the permission, including executing the file. This is actually relevant for executables, like bash scripts and so on. Let's see 666, which is read-write permission for each one. So it's pretty easy, actually. We want read and write for the root user, and we can leave the rest as is with 0 permissions. And now let's try our vim command again and try to edit the file. And if I hit I, as you see, we have insert mode or edit mode. And now I can delete stuff, I can change stuff, and so on. And you can navigate with your up and down arrows in the insert mode. And let's make our fix here. Let's delete this and set the right port. And as I said, in order to exit the edit mode, we click on escape. And in order to close the file or editor and save the changes, we use colon. And instead of Q and exclamation mark, we say write and quit. So this will save the changes and quit the editor. So now if we check dbconf, as you see, we have made our change here. And there you go. We have made our change. So now when we restart our application, it should be able to connect to the database on the correct port. And the final command to exit from the Docker container back to your operating system terminal, you simply type exit, and there you go. Back in my Mac OS. And if I execute Unix name here, I see my Darwin-based operating system. And that's how you can use an array of Linux commands in order to troubleshoot an issue, find files on your file system, navigate around, make changes to the file permissions, and so on. And we can actually change the permission of our file back to read-only to lock it down, so to say, like this. And there you go. Let me know if this video was useful for you, and feel free to share it with one friend or colleague that you think will benefit from it. And with that, Thank you and see you in the next video.